A professional camera body that costs $6,000 in 2023 will sell on the used market for $3,000 in 2026. The lenses attached to it depreciate more slowly, losing roughly 10 to 15% of their value per year if they're well maintained and not superseded by a newer optical design. The lighting equipment in the bag, the strobes, the modifiers, the light stands, the wireless triggers, loses value faster than the lenses and slower than the camera body, settling at roughly 40 to 50% of retail within 3 years. Before a photography business earns its first dollar of revenue, it is losing money on the equipment it purchased to earn that revenue, and the rate of that loss is built into the asset class in a way that most new photographers do not calculate when they price their first job. The total equipment investment required to operate a professional photography business at a level that clients in the wedding, portrait, commercial, and event categories expect ranges from $8,000 at the absolute minimum to over $40,000 for a fully equipped operation with redundant bodies, a comprehensive lens selection, professional lighting, and the computing hardware required for post-production. That range is wide because the requirements differ dramatically by specialty. A wedding photographer needs 2 camera bodies for redundancy because a single body failure during a ceremony is a business-ending event for that client relationship and potentially for the photographer's reputation. A studio portrait photographer needs continuous or strobe lighting systems, backdrops, and a physical space that a wedding photographer does not. A commercial product photographer needs macro lenses, specialized lighting rigs, and tethering equipment that a portrait photographer may never touch. The equipment list defines the capital requirement, and the capital requirement defines the financial threshold that must be cleared before the business generates any return on the investment. The most common entry point into the photography business is wedding photography, and the economics of that entry point illustrate the financial structure of the industry more clearly than any other specialty. The average wedding photography package in the United States in 2024 was priced between $2,500 and $4,000, according to industry surveys from The Knot and Wedding Wire. That average includes the entire range from budget photographers charging $800 for 4 hours of coverage to premium photographers charging $8,000 or more for full-day coverage with albums and second shooters. The median, which is more informative than the average because it is less distorted by the high end, sits closer to $2,800. A wedding photographer who books 30 weddings per year at an average package of $3,000 generates $90,000 in gross revenue. That number sounds like a viable income until the cost structure beneath it is examined. The second shooter, who is standard at most weddings above the budget tier, costs between $300 and $600 per event. The editing time for a full wedding runs between 20 and 40 hours depending on the photographer's workflow and the number of deliverable images, which typically ranges from 400 to 800 final edited photographs. If the photographer outsources editing to a professional retouching service, the cost runs between $200 and $500 per wedding. If the photographer edits personally, the time investment at any reasonable hourly valuation represents a cost that most photographers do not account for because they do not separate their shooting income from their editing labor. At 30 weddings per year with a second shooter at $400 per wedding and self-edited post-production valued at 30 hours per wedding at a conservative internal rate of $30 per hour, the labor cost alone is $12,000 for second shooters and $27,000 in editing time. Add the annual equipment depreciation of approximately $4,000 to $6,000, liability insurance at $500 to $1,500 per year, software subscriptions for Adobe Creative Cloud and gallery delivery platforms at approximately $1,000 per year, website hosting and marketing at another $500 to $2,000, transportation costs for driving to venues, and the tax obligation on self-employment income at approximately 15.3% for the self-employment tax alone before income tax. The $90,000 in gross revenue becomes something closer to $35,000 to $45,000 in actual take-home income, and that is before any consideration of health insurance, retirement savings, or the cost of the unpaid administrative hours spent on client communication, contract management, scheduling, and bookkeeping. The photographers who make wedding photography financially sustainable have generally solved one of two problems. They have either raised their average package price high enough that the cost structure represents a smaller percentage of revenue, or they have built a volume operation efficient enough that the per wedding cost is lower than the industry average. A photographer charging $6,000 per wedding and booking 25 weddings generates $150,000 in gross revenue, and the cost structure that consumed half of the $90,000 operation now consumes a smaller fraction because many of the costs are fixed or semi-fixed rather than proportional to revenue. The second shooter still costs $400 per wedding. The editing still takes 30 hours. The insurance, software, and equipment depreciation remain roughly the same. But the gross margin per wedding has increased from roughly $1,500 to roughly $3,500, and the annual take-home income has moved from the $35,000 to $45,000 range into the $70,000 to $90,000 range for a similar number of working days. Reaching the $6,000 price point requires a portfolio, a reputation, and a market position that most photographers need 3 to 5 years of active shooting to develop. The first year of a wedding photography business is almost universally unprofitable when equipment purchases are amortized into the calculation. Photographers who enter the market by undercutting established competitors on price, charging $800 or $1,200 for full-day coverage, are working at rates that cannot sustain the business once equipment replacement cycles, insurance renewals, and the actual time investment are honestly calculated. The low-price entry strategy acquires clients, but it acquires clients who selected the photographer on price, which means those clients will select the next photographer on price as well. And the referral network that develops from price-sensitive clients produces more price-sensitive clients, rather than clients willing to pay the rates that the business needs to survive. Portrait photography, which includes family portraits, senior portraits, headshots, and personal branding sessions, operates on a different economic model than weddings because the session time is shorter, but the client acquisition cost per dollar of revenue is often higher. A typical portrait session lasts between 30 minutes and 2 hours, and the pricing structure can be session fee-based, print and product-based, or a combination of both. Session fees for professional portrait photographers range from $150 to $500 at the mid-market level, with premium portrait photographers in major metropolitan markets charging $750 to $1,500 per session. The print and product model, which was the dominant pricing structure in portrait photography for decades, generates revenue from the sale of prints, canvases, albums, and other physical products after the session rather than from the session fee itself. In this model, the session fee may be low or nominal, but the expected per-client revenue from product sales ranges from $500 to $2,000 depending on the studio's price list and the client's purchasing behavior. The challenge of the print and product model in the current market is that digital delivery has become the expectation of many portrait clients, and digital delivery eliminates the product revenue stream that the model depends on. A photographer who charges a $200 session fee and delivers 50 digitally retouched images generates $200 per client minus the cost of editing, studio overhead, and client acquisition. At that revenue level, the photographer needs a very high volume of sessions to generate meaningful annual income, and the client acquisition effort required to maintain that volume consumes time and money that further reduces the effective hourly rate. The photographers who maintain profitability in portrait work have generally adopted a hybrid model that combines a meaningful session fee with an in-person sales session where prints, wall art, and albums are presented and purchased, maintaining per-client revenue in the $500 to $1,500 range. The in-person sales component of portrait photography economics is one of the most significant differentiators between photographers who make a living from portrait work and photographers who supplement another income with occasional portrait sessions. In-person sales, often called IPS in the photography business community, involves a viewing and ordering appointment where the client sees their images projected or printed in sample form and makes purchasing decisions with the photographer present. The average in-person sales transaction for photographers who have developed a process and the product catalog to support it runs between $800 and $2,000 per session. A portrait photographer conducting 4 IPS sessions per week at an average sale of $1,200 generates approximately $250,000 in gross product and session revenue annually. The cost of goods for prints and products runs between 25 and 35% of the retail price, and the remaining margin covers the photographer's time, studio costs, and profit. Commercial photography, which includes advertising, editorial, product, food, architectural, and corporate work, operates on yet another economic model that differs from both wedding and portrait photography in fundamental ways. Commercial photography is priced by usage rights, day rate, and production complexity, rather than by session time or deliverable count. Day rates for commercial photographers range from $1,500 per day for emerging commercial shooters to $5,000 or more for established photographers with significant portfolio credentials. The usage license, which grants the client the right to use the images for specific purposes in specific media for a specific duration, is often a separate line item that can equal or exceed the creative fee. A photograph used in a national print advertising campaign carries a usage fee that reflects the reach and commercial value of that placement, and that fee is negotiated based on factors including circulation, duration of use, exclusivity, and geographic scope. The commercial photography market has experienced significant pricing pressure from stock photography platforms and from the improving capabilities of smartphone cameras for certain categories of product photography. iStock, Shutterstock, Adobe Stock, and similar platforms offer licensed images for between $1 and $50 per image, which has made commissioned photography unnecessary for many low-budget applications that historically would have required a photographer. The commercial photographers who have maintained their rates and their client base have done so by operating at a quality level, a conceptual level, and a production level that stock photography cannot replicate. A food photographer who creates images for a national restaurant chain is producing work that involves a food stylist, a prop stylist, specific lighting design, and art direction that a stock photo simply cannot provide for that brand's specific needs. The studio overhead question is one of the largest fixed cost decisions in the photography business, and it separates photographers into fundamentally different economic categories. Renting a dedicated studio space in a mid-sized city costs between $1,000 and $3,000 per month, depending on the size, location, and build-out. In major metropolitan markets like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, comparable studio space runs from $3,000 to $8,000 per month. That fixed cost must be covered regardless of how many sessions are booked in a given month, and it creates a revenue floor that the business must clear before any other expense or any profit can be realized. A photographer paying $24,000 per year in studio rent needs to generate that amount in additional revenue compared to a photographer working from a home studio or renting studio space by the day as needed. The day rental studio model has become increasingly viable as an alternative to permanent studio leases, with rental studios available in most mid-size and large cities at rates ranging from $50 to $300 per hour depending on the space, equipment included, and market. A portrait photographer who rents studio space for 4-hour sessions twice per week at $150 per session spends approximately $15,600 per year on studio rental, which is less than a permanent lease in most markets, while eliminating the risk of paying for unused space during slow periods. The trade-off is that the rented space is not branded to the photographer, is shared with other photographers, and does not provide the same impression of permanence and establishment that a dedicated studio offers to clients for whom that impression matters. The economics of the photography business are also shaped by the ongoing education and skill development investment that the industry requires. Camera technology changes on a roughly 2-year cycle, with new sensor capabilities, autofocus systems, and video features creating both opportunities and competitive pressure. Workshops and educational courses from established photographers run from $200 to $3,000 per event. Photography conferences like WPPI, Imaging USA, and regional photography events cost between $500 and $2,000 in registration fees, plus travel and accommodation. The educational investment is real and cannot be deferred indefinitely without the photographer's work falling behind the quality expectations of the market, but it represents a cost that does not directly generate revenue and must be absorbed within the existing margin structure. Post-production time is the hidden cost that more consistently erodes photographer profitability than any other single factor. A photographer who charges $1,500 for a portrait session that takes 2 hours to shoot and then spends 8 hours editing the images has earned $150 per hour for the shooting time and is being paid $0 per hour for the editing time, unless that editing time was factored into the session price. Most photographers at the early and mid-career stages undervalue their editing time because they perform it at home, outside of scheduled client hours, and perceive it as a less valuable activity than the creative act of shooting. It is not less valuable. It is the activity that determines the quality of the final deliverable, and it consumes more cumulative hours than any other single task in the photography business. Outsourcing post-production has become a significant trend among photographers who have recognized the economic imbalance between shooting rates and editing hours. Professional culling and editing services like Shoot.edit, Photographer's Edit, and international retouching services charge between 30 cents and $1.50 per image for basic editing and color correction. For a wedding photographer delivering 600 images, outsourced editing costs between $180 and $900 per wedding, which at the lower end of that range represents a small fraction of a $3,000 package price. The photographer who outsources editing at $300 per wedding and redirects the 25 hours of editing time toward either booking additional clients or performing higher-value business tasks is making an economic calculation that favors margin over control, and for many photographers, the math supports that decision clearly. The insurance requirements for a photography business extend beyond the basic liability policy that most photographers purchase as their first and sometimes only coverage. General liability insurance, which covers bodily injury and property damage, claims arising from the photographer's business operations, cost between $300 and $800 per year for typical coverage limits. Equipment insurance, often called inland marine insurance, covers the camera bodies, lenses, lighting, and computer equipment against theft, damage, and loss, and costs between $300 and $1,000 per year, depending on the total insured value. Professional liability insurance, sometimes called errors and omissions coverage, protects against claims arising from the photographer's professional services, such as a claim that the photographer failed to deliver the contracted images or delivered images of unacceptable quality, and costs an additional $200 to $500 per year. A photographer operating without equipment insurance is accepting the risk that a $6,000 camera body and $4,000 in lenses could be stolen from a car, dropped at a venue, or damaged in transit with no financial recourse other than purchasing replacements out of pocket. The question that prospective photography business owners rarely ask with sufficient precision is what annual income they need the business to provide, and what volume of work at what price point will produce that income after all costs are subtracted. A photographer who needs $75,000 in take-home income after self-employment tax, income tax, equipment depreciation, insurance, software, marketing, and operating expenses needs to generate roughly $130,000 to $150,000 in gross revenue, depending on the cost structure. At a wedding average of $3,500 and 30 weddings per year, gross revenue is $105,000, which after costs produces a take-home closer to $50,000 than $75,000. The gap between $50,000 and $75,000 must be filled by either raising the average wedding price, adding weddings, adding a second revenue stream like portraits or commercial work, or reducing costs in ways that do not compromise the quality that supports the current pricing. Many sessions have become a popular supplemental revenue strategy for portrait photographers, particularly during holiday seasons. A mini session is a shortened portrait sitting, typically 15 to 20 minutes, offered at a lower price point than a full session, usually between $150 and $350, and scheduled in back-to-back time slots to maximize the photographer's hourly revenue. A photographer who books 12 mini sessions in a single day at $250 per session generates $3,000 in gross revenue for approximately 6 hours of shooting time plus 4 to 8 hours of editing time. The per-session editing time is reduced because mini sessions typically deliver 15 to 25 images per client rather than the 50 to 100 images of a full session, which means the editing cost per dollar of revenue is lower, even though the session fee is also lower. Mini session days, when well marketed and fully booked, can produce some of the highest effective hourly rates in the portrait photography business. The market for professional photography is simultaneously expanding in some categories and contracting in others, and the direction of the trend matters for anyone evaluating the business as a long-term income source. The wedding photography market remains large and relatively stable in terms of total spending, though the number of photographers competing for that spending has increased substantially with the lowering of equipment barriers to entry. The corporate headshot and branding photography market has grown significantly as businesses invest in professional imagery for websites, social media, and marketing materials. The real estate photography market has expanded with the growth of online property listings and virtual tours, with real estate photographers charging between $100 and $500 per property depending on the scope of deliverables. The event photography market, outside of weddings, has been compressed by the improving quality of smartphone cameras, which has reduced the perceived need for a professional photographer at many corporate and social events that would have hired one a decade ago. The photographers who build sustainable businesses tend to share certain structural decisions regardless of their specialty. They track their cost of doing business with the same rigor that any small business owner would, calculating their annual expenses and dividing by their expected number of revenue-generating sessions to determine the minimum session price that covers costs before any profit. They maintain a client relationship management system that handles inquiries, contracts, invoicing, and follow-up communication without requiring manual effort for each transaction. They invest in marketing channels that produce measurable returns, whether that is search engine optimization for their website, targeted social media advertising, or relationship building with venue coordinators and wedding planners who generate referrals. The photography business is a real business with real economics that are calculable, manageable, and in many cases quite favorable for photographers who run it with the financial discipline that any service business requires. The photographers who struggle financially are overwhelmingly photographers who have not done the arithmetic of cost of doing business, who price their work based on what competitors charge rather than what their own cost structure demands, and who treat the business as a creative pursuit first and a financial enterprise second. Reversing that priority, treating it as a financial enterprise that happens to involve creative work, is a structural decision that determines whether photography remains a profession or becomes an expensive hobby that intermittently generates taxable income.